the key ask which society and civil society has been asking for many years. So therefore, we thought to have this conversation. One is about the process, because as we know that this time whole CS20 process has been done online. How and how challenging it is to have these processes to on online basis, where you don't have face-to-face conversation, but even then you keep intact the participation, you keep intact the concerns and engagement of everyone into this. I think we thought that we must learn and from the, especially with the group of Saudi Arabia, so that we can prepare ourselves for future. What's going to be our status in Italy or after that in India? So one is the preparation, that how should we all move towards a better future with this new normal, what we are calling it. I think this is one of the major concerns we had. So the first session is focused towards that. And the second session is also when these whole institutions are going to be redefined. Especially you see nowadays, you can see the global politics in which we are moving. Each country is having their own concern and questions. So the international institutions are also going to be questioned, like WHO or all those things. In this process, how we can, further strengthen and use this opportunity to further strengthen the participation of civil society in these structures, and C20 is one of them. So we thought to have a second conversation on the key recommendations which are there from the civil society in the context of COVID or in the context of current realities.
So we can commence. Thank you, Harji. Important valid points coming from there. We'll initiate the discussion and we'll go to our first round of panelists. Her Royal Highness Noof can please start.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And not only do I wish you peace, I wish you health and safety. And I'd like to start out today by thanking the organizers for this important event. And I'd like to give you a quick executive, if you will, overview of our values and developments in progress this year. First, it is a great honor to have been handed responsibility for the C20 presidency. And I'd like to briefly outline the process as we've experienced it over the last 12 months, because without a committed sense of the mechanisms needed to make the Troika roll smoothly, I don't think the C20 could maintain its developing identity as an authoritative and guiding official body for the G20. It's more like a relay race with no end, and we just keep having to hand the baton from one person to the other. A key challenge in a body such as the C20 that we face is a balancing act. How do we balance the need for collaboration and inclusiveness on the one hand with continuity and coherence on the other? And if we are to be effective, we must strive hard within this context to close the G20 implementation gap between policy and action. And we can only do this if we maintain a consistent and clear course through the Troika presidencies, maintain a clear sense of the SDGs, and yet manage to adapt to the unpredictable global regional events in ways that do not disrupt us from our path. Last year, a fundamentally important development occurred, and that was the identification of our guiding principles. The C20 Steering Committee and the IEC last year, during last year's presidency, provided us not simply with 8 key values, but with touchstones on how to go about making policy. Our principles are a guide to which we constantly refer, and I in the Saudi Secretariat have felt in particular the importance and value of transparency and collaboration. These core values have been invaluable early on during the handover process. And for that, I'd like to thank Masaki and our esteemed Japanese colleagues, some of which I'm happy to see here today, for their guidance, for their openness. Their generous input helped us to start bringing together the steering committees. But now I'd like to take you back a step earlier. So within 2019, what we have done here was, if you will, grid a power map of the people that we will need to contact to establish the C20 identity here. And then after April, when we came back with a very important policy pack with us in hand, we started knocking on doors. We started trying to identify leads who we thought might be chairs, co-chairs, working group leads, relevant ministers. And we did this not only just to advocate for the policy pack, but also to establish what the C20 is. Not only that, yes, they know that what C20 stands for, or civil society, but also to plant the seed that civil society and C20 and its members are topic experts. And not only do we point out problems and what societies need, but we have solutions that are implementable. Another thing that we worked hard to develop was a regional focus. This year, we felt the importance of including the voice of the Global South. And not only do we feel that the G20 policies direct to the Global South need a greater emphasis on that region, but also we felt the importance that the Global South voice be heard directly and not through proxies. And I hope our policy pack successfully captures the importance of inclusivity, and that it manages to reiterate that the vulnerable and unempowered must not be left behind. Today there was, I think it was today that it came out, the new UN statistics for the displaced. And the last time I looked at it, it was 60. Today it is 80 million displaced. So this slogan is more important than ever, and becomes more important in light of this pandemic. Finally, I have to express how grateful we have been to all the steering committee members, the international advisory committee members during these difficult times. They've shown great solidarity. They've shown tremendous professionalism and commitment. And the C20, because of this, has managed to maintain a steady and progressive course in spite of all the adversities. And I'm very grateful and honored to have met the people that I met, learned what they do, learned from them, gained more experience. It has been a very pleasurable experience for me, and I think for all of us. And I also would like to say that all the work that has been done, and with their help in identifying most amazing leads, we have produced work and achievements that we should be proud of. And I will just add to this, though, that the real test of our success will lie within our advocacy efforts up and coming, and how effectively our words will influence G20 policy and actions in November. And with that, I'd like to hand it to Osama. Thank you.
Thank you, Princess. And I'd like to reiterate the thanks and appreciation for the organizers of this call and the members of C20. Today, we prepared a very short presentation to take you over the process. Starting with our leadership structure, we've managed to increase the focus on Global South representation, and for the first time Pacific voices, and managing to bring as many nationalities and perspectives as possible from civil society around the world. The C20, on top of the Steering Committee and International Advisory Committee, has 11 working groups, which has been this year the biggest C20 in terms of the number of working groups. Since this year, we have elevated the Digital Economy Task Force into a working group. Every working group has an international lead and a local lead. And with nominating and working with the leads, we've tried to make sure that we represent the most diverse expertise and geographic representation and gender balance. In terms of membership, which is still open to civil society from all around the world, so far we have been joined by 750 representatives of civil society from 80 countries, and the number is growing as we receive more registrations through the website. In January last year, we had a kickoff meeting in Riyadh, where the leadership structure and the leads met for the first time and endorsed their communique and their action plan for the year and the 2020 advocacy strategy. And we recommitted to the C20 principles that were adopted in 2019. All of these the outcome documents were published transparently on the C20 website, and we continue to report back as we move on with the execution. The C20 is an important element of the ecosystem of the G20, and to understand that, we would need to look into the landscape of the G20, starting from the finance track, which has been a closed and more restrictive space for economic policy making in the G20, and then the Sherpa track, which involves all non-economic and non-financial issues, including employment, health, energy, climate, and the rest of the issues. All of these tracks end up with the ministerial meetings. As Arjun said, this year we had many extraordinary ministerial meetings that were scheduled specifically to address the COVID-19. And also the year ends with a leaders summit, which also this year there was an extraordinary leaders summit. Throughout the process, in the working groups, in the ministerials, and in the leaders meetings, engagement groups come in to bring their perspectives. They bring independent voice representing their stakeholders. As C20, we represent civil society, and we're honored to be channeling these voices. So for every ministerial meeting, we issue a statement. For every year, we issue a policy pack that has policy papers. For every leaders summit, we issue a response, we issue a statement before, and we try to make sure that we publicly and privately advocate for civil society's perspective within the G20 process. Our ambition from the beginning of the year was to increase C20's access to G20's meetings. And so far we've received an important invitation to the Sherpa meeting that will be held in September. We also have attended, the C20 chair has attended the Digital Economy Ministerial meeting. We were also invited to the very first G20 anti-corruption ministerial meeting in October. And so far we've participated in a number of official working group meetings, including education, development, health, employment, digital economy, and anti-corruption. At the same time, we have been also successful in getting access to side events. Some of them were virtual and some of them were physical before the pandemic. So we've managed to attend some finance track meetings around taxation, some climate meetings around carbon capture, some environment meetings around land degradation, and many other meetings that we were able to present civil society's voices. In these meetings, C20 is represented by its expert leads and members who are most familiar with these topics. We also work in line with other engagement groups. So at the beginning of the year, we have, as C20, proposed a joint statement on global pandemic preparedness. It was endorsed and joined by the B20, the L20, the T20, W20, and Y20. And we managed to ring the bell early on for the G20 to respond and prepare for the pandemic. We will continue working throughout the year with other engagement groups. As we mentioned, there have been many statements. The very first statement that was issued in January was about defending human rights in civic spaces. We also issued an urgent statement before the leaders' virtual summit and a response afterwards. We also sent open letters to ministers of health and ministers of employment. We also held the face-to-face meetings, which were one-on-one meetings between C20 working groups and G20 working groups back in March, and it was attended by 260 civil society participants, engaging with 27 different G20 officials. As you know, our very last achievement has been the launch of the C20 Policy Pack, which is a big document that summarizes all civil society's perspectives on G20 issues, 11 policy papers addressing G20 priorities and legacy issues, while also maintaining continuity of civil society's asks from previous years. The C20 policy pack had two different compendiums, Sherpa track compendium and a finance track compendium, to make sure that we directly address the policy questions of the G20. Our timeline is still halfway through. We're still in June. We have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of advocacy and leading up to the C20 summit, which is scheduled to take place on October 6th until 9th. We are also preparing to work on the C20 communique, which is the political declaration of C20, which is supposed to come out on the C20 summit and has a very extensive consultative process in the way that will start in September. We would like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to present C20 this year, and we invite you to join us as members and registering to be part of the civil society movement through our website. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Osama. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive C20 chart that you showed us. I mean, it's been really helpful, you know, with the advocacy charts and all. And special thank you to Nu for actually placing before us the need for a new strategy, the institutionalization of C20, you know, around the identifications of the guiding principles and taking it forward. I mean, this is something which is important, and it came out in Japan, and almost all C20 members have been following that. So, and especially a great thanks for also including the voice of the global South, because G20 by nature is you know, is a multilateral that has been always focused on the global North, and somehow it has now shifted its trajectory, its paradigm to the global South. And I think Saudi Arabia has led that way. Now we will go towards the second part of the first half. I would now like to invite Stefania Burbo from GCAP Italy, who's joining us from the Italian experiences, who will be telling us about the C20 process in Italy. Thank you, Stefania. Welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, you're very audible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Harsh and Indian colleagues for organizing this very useful event and for inviting me. I'm the focal point of an Italian civil society network called Global Health Italian Network, and I'm also one of the two spokesperson of GCAP Italy. GCAP is a global call to action against poverty, and we are the Italian section of Global GCAP. Now, just a few words on how we in Italy has been organizing the next C20. GCAP Italy has always been a key interlocutor for Italian institutions with regard to G7 and G20. We were very much involved in the G7 process when Italy had the last two presidencies, but we have started working with the Italian institutions, mainly the G20 Sherpa office since last year, with regard to the next G20 process. And GCAP in Italy is working in order to have, well, we are a wide civil society coalition, but we are working in order to have a wider civil society coalition in Italy, able to implement, to lead the next C20. And we are also prepared our first political demands on the priorities to be submitted to our G20 Sherpa office and in general to Italian institutions. Now, with a few words with regard to the next G20 agenda. Of course, it has not yet been announced officially, but as we are in contact with the G20 Sherpa office, they, in an informal way, gave us some information. So of course everything could change, but they told us that they would like to work on macro pillars. One is inclusion, with a focus on women, youth, and vulnerable groups. Another macro pillar is energy transformation. And the third macro pillar is innovation and knowledge, also in connection with the prevention of new outbreaks of COVID-19 and new pandemics, and also in connection with digitization and its impact on work. Each macro pillar contains topics such as food systems, education, better recovery, sustainable development and inequalities, the relation between people and the planet, and they want to use a holistic approach, highlighting the interconnections among topics. Now, global health. As you know, since the outbreak of COVID-19, global health has, I would say, regained a leading role in the global political agenda. And we were told by the G20 Chair Office that it will be a priority, as you can imagine, in the next G20 agenda, with a focus on health systems strengthening. Now, our first reflections on the G20 process. As generally civil society worldwide thinks, we think that the crisis found a very fertile ground. That is, our development challenges did not start with COVID-19 and will not end with COVID-19. So this is one of the first reflections that we would like to convey to Italian institutions. And also we would like to start a reflection with them, with the mandate of the G20 that was created to focus on global finance regulation. And we will ask to focus very much again on this topic to ensure that financial systems and flows support the global sustainable development agenda. Of course, we are aware that the G20 agenda has expanded over the years, and so G20 is an opportunity to discuss nationally and internationally many topics. And of course, we are going to start a reflection at the beginning of the next year within the C20 in order to submit our recommendations all together on the topics of the G20 agenda. Now, the last words. I was asked how to say something on how can we engage more civil society organization from across the world. Well, right now I have no an answer, and we could discuss later on during the webinar is clever. But I think that the great work of the Saudi C20 and the previous C20 presidencies will help us have a wide involvement of civil society organization worldwide. I mean, we have already a wide international civil society platform engaged thanks to the effort of these and previous presidencies. We have in the previous speakers told us that they were able to have more civil society from the global south. So I think the civil society coalitions already involved in the civil process can help reach civil society organization worldwide, and the C20 steering committee and advisory committee will be key. For us, it's one thing that we think really very important is that not just civil society from G20 countries have to be involved, because G20 is a global platform discussing global issues. So it is extremely important to have civil society from all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. Thank you so much for that, for your take on the G20 process in Italy. Now we will go to Riccardo for much more discussion on the legitimacy of the C20 grouping and how it can take forward in 2021 with the Italian presidency. Thanks.
Yeah, good. Well, here from Italy, good morning. And somewhere else, I saw Aoi. It's already good afternoon for some of you, everybody. Yeah, I will go shortly on the same line open already by Nurfosama and now by Stefania. Starting from the issue of legitimation, in fact, one of the concern that we have to maintain and the awareness is that G20 is not a UN institution. It's not an official democratic institution based on a participatory process that is open. It's a group that is reserved to a specific number of participants by invitation, and pragmatically, we work with the G20 because we do know that within the G20 process, we have, they play a lot of decision-making, a lot of steps in the decision-making process. So pragmatically, it's important that civil society is able to speak with the G20 to have an influence on the decision-making process. But we have to always raise up the concern about legitimation. So in our opinion, G20 is, of course, is not the world government and hasn't to act as if it is, or tasking international institutions or things like that. But it's precisely the other way around. That is that the G20, with the power that it has in terms of economic and financial dimension of its member, could act at the service of the multilateral process, at the service of UN goals, undertaking its responsibility. And it is in this direction that our advocacy goes. So the story of G20 starts in 1999, when there was a need to coordinate a bit more the economic policies the richest country or the biggest country, because there was the concern or the awareness that the G7 was not enough. You remember G7 started in 1975 after the first oil crisis, and then developed. It was just a G5 at first, even 3, then 7, then 8, including Russia, then coming back to 7. But then they realized that 7 was not enough. So they started meeting in 1999. In the year 2008, during the financial crisis, the G20 members realized that they need to act together. So the G20 became a relevant forum, and before it was just a sort of a light opportunity to meet and to share some ideas. The point is that now the G20 developed a sort of global agenda, and this can be an opportunity, but we have to always remember that our agenda is the Agenda 2030, 2030 United Nations agenda. And it is in that framework that we have to act. So what we are trying to do as civil society dealing within the C20 process is to speak with the G20 on the different issues, but always remembering that anything we do together, it has to be done to reinforce, to strengthen the UN process. In that sense, our role as civil society, even in perspective, is of course to work in the direction of inclusion, that is in the process, as Stefania, but also Nuf and Osama already said, we have to include civil society actors that are not only from the 20 countries, of course. We call for transparency. We call also for a full respect of human rights. The issue of human rights is very delicate within the G20. We do know that some members have a very, let's say, bad track on respect of human rights. So with the technical agenda on the policy sectors, we have to always maintain this call on the human rights, and to show that when we speak about health, when we speak about other issues, we are speaking about something that is originated and related by the framework of human rights. And in the perspective we have in front of us, I think that we have to reflect, to continue reflecting how we will be able in our advocacy to ask G20 to concentrate on their responsibility. They are mainly regarding their economic and financial power, strengthening the, I repeat, UN agenda instead of developing a parallel agenda. And we have to understand how we will be able to include more actors in the C20 process, and how to put the C20 process in a strong link with all the other processes of civil society that are focusing on UN. C20 is not a parallel and separate process, mustn't be seen as an interesting opportunity to advocacy that is just related to that opportunity, but it has to be thought as one of among other instruments that as a civil society we have to strengthen the global action of civil society within the multilateral process that I repeat is the United Nations process, to strengthen the call for human rights and the voice of the most powerful and the most vulnerable. Our duty is to represent the most vulnerable. And So I'm happy to be in this call also because meetings like that are useful to build links among us, to understand each other, to be more familiar, and to provide and feed the links I was referring to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for that very short summary that you made, of the legitimacy on the G20 and the expectations also. I think we will have question and rounds from the participants later after we have finished all the panel speakers. We have 2 panel speakers ahead of us. Stefano, if you can kindly present us with your take on the financing part of the G20 vis-a-vis the COVID-19 pandemic.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I think allow me a special hello to my good friend Danaru. It's glad to see him on the call after we haven't talked for some time. So it's really a pleasure. I will be relatively brief and then maybe understand more if there are particular interests here that could be picked up in the question and answer, because we have quite some time for that. And I will just make 3 main points. The International Financial Architecture Working Group of the Civil 20 in many ways goes a bit at the core of the G20 mandate, as Stefania and Ricardo have mentioned earlier, because the G20 originates precisely by an effort to somehow respond to the need for financial regulation, and in particular after the never-ended financial crisis of the 2008-2009 period. So in this respect, let me make 3 major considerations. The first one, it's important to recognize that this particular crisis is very different than a financial crisis. It cannot be regarded to as a financial crisis because it is primarily a real life, real economy crisis. Not only because it originates within the health domain and because it has immediate impact and repercussions on care and social protection, but primarily because it has generated a significant slowdown of the global economy, one global economy that was already struggling somehow to find a new pathway in its continuous and sometimes not fully understood from our view research for this sort of continuous growth patterns. So it's a real economy that has demonstrated the inability of globalization, or rather hyper-globalization, the way in which we've experienced in the past years, to really stimulate and nurture inclusive and domestic economies that also respond not only to our economic dynamics, but a mix of social, ecological, and cultural dimensions. And therefore it has exposed in many ways the reality. It hasn't generated it, but has found a very fertile ground in a global economy trapped by deep inequalities within and between countries, and in many ways trapped by these inequalities into a structural gap in demand, a continuous excess of liquidity, and an inability of productive activities to access to credit. Now, this is a bit a dystopian reality because in orthodox theory, these 3 dimensions, gap in demand, excess of liquidity, and inability to access credit for productive activity don't coexist. They would normally not be there, but it's precisely in the perverse and aberrant inequalities within which we live that these different dynamics actually materialize. I think COVID also exposed the fact that many structural inequalities within countries continue to be trapped by inequalities between countries. And the fact that the hyper-globalization pattern has generated a division of labor and a structural dependence in many ways that many have referred to as just a new colonial phase, just with a different type of pattern. And that has really promoted the continuous extraction from the south towards the north, starting from minerals, then increasingly looking at commodities, and of late, certainly also financial extraction. So why am I making this long story? Because it's impossible to look at particular recommendations on financial architecture if we do not recognize that in the first place, we are confronted with a need for profound transformation of the real economy, rather than purely look at its financial manifestations or the finance economy on the other side, which is what primarily the G20 is concerned with. And in many respects, that real economy change needs to shift the center of gravity of domestic economies, particularly within developing countries, much more away from the global and really in favor of a much stronger, vibrant, virtuous domestic economy cycle, sometimes in the context of closer regional agreements and regional cooperation with nearby countries, or in the context of regional economies. And that means that the primary issue for this transformation has to do with policy space. And this policy space leads us to reconsider trade, investment agreement, intellectual property rights, and many other critical domains that actually relate to that sort of real economy transformation. So it's important to have this premise, because without that, it's difficult to understand the rest. And this is the reason why part of the what the group has also suggested in agreement with major economic justice platform is really to make the United Nations, much more than the G20, the space in which this new global consensus on what an economic reconstruction agenda would look like as absolutely necessary for really confronting the structural and longer term impact, economic and financial impact of the crisis. So as a first point, it's important to have this consideration, the need for a new consensus on how our economies are interacting, and the need therefore to reframe globalization with a much more stronger domestic economy dimension than what we have seen in the globalization on steroids that we had over the last 10, 15 years. Second major point. Now, having done this premise, what is the immediate and let's say short-term agenda to confront the crisis? Well, having said all of this, there are still very strong liquidity concerns that many developing countries, and not only because I'm speaking from Italy and we're not in such a different situation, that countries are confronted with. And therefore, the need to expand fiscal space is the primary immediate concern. What is the best way to do it? Well, the first way is to ensure that resources that are already available within countries can actually be directed to the health care, social protection, real economy measures that are necessary. And that means that the immediate action is actually to cancel, and I say cancel rather than postpone, debt payments. And therefore, the debt unsustainability, and in particularly in the COVID circumstances, is the most important measures. Now, the G20 has taken some initial steps in this respect, thanks to the initiative for debt service suspension. But it's really a very, very mild step, particularly because it only kicks the can down the road, by kicking to the future payments. And while it may address immediate financial liquidity concerns, it doesn't really solve the current issues, which is much more structural and much more in-depth than that. But anyway, for very many reasons, addressing the need for short-term debt relief measures, let's call them like this, is essential. And now this, of course, has to do with sovereign debt, but has very strong impact in terms of also private creditors, as you know. So it's a complex issue. I don't think it's now the moment to dive too much into it. But the most important issue is address, let's say, in all its dimensions, the need for immediate debt relief to make sure that resources that are currently resident within countries can be addressed to confront a crisis. Now, of course, the second important issue here is to recognize that because of the slowdown of the economies, and very often the slowdown of global value chains, and therefore the significant drop in commodity prices and in commodity goods demand, this also means that many countries are confronted with a significant decrease in tax revenues or generally fiscal revenues. That unfortunately requires additional measures. And this may mean that there could be different attempts to strengthen again tax revenues in this particular phase by, for instance, taxing the digital economy with country unilateral decisions, maybe adopt some particular taxes on wealth, or maybe even use financial transaction taxes that also may have other implications other than generating fixed revenues. And I'm therefore moving to the third important dimension here, which is related to the capital management, capital account management. You all familiar with the fact that already immediately few weeks into the crisis, the movement of capital out of the global south has been enormous, much bigger than what we've even seen during the last financial crisis. Hence the need to adopt capital account management measures that would actually be able to manage inflows and outflows in a much more conducive manner, and at the same time would also be able somehow to free and be able to use monetary policies much more than it would normally happen in a condition of completely open capital flows. So there's much more into the recommendations. I invite you to look into that, but I guess in terms of short-term measures, these might be the most important elements, of course, that have been proposed. Now, this takes me to the last, third and last point, which is the fact that these short-term measures need to be framed into a need for longer-term systemic structural reforms. And this means that alone the liquidity issue will not address the longer-term solvency issue. So first and foremost, we can not only look at band-aid arrangements towards that, but rather we need to really explore a complete restructuring of unsustainable debt situation, particularly when in many cases, not only this debt is unsustainable, but might also be considered illegitimate, and is therefore quite problematic for countries to go into painful adjustments that impact on people's lives when people haven't benefited a lot or at all from those particular debt exposures. So the need for a comprehensive UN-centered mechanism to ensure the restructuring in a comprehensive manner that includes private category or sovereign debt is essential. Hence the need to combine that short-term debt relief measure with this more structural changes that really bring back debt to sustainability levels. And a lot of people are evoking the terms Marshall Plan, but nobody remembers that the key elements of the Marshall Plan was actually the cancellation of debt. So it's really at the core of the systemic reform. The other important dimension of the systemic reform is the recognition that fiscal space isn't only about debt, but is also primarily about taxes. And this means that we need to seek a long-term, inclusive and comprehensive solution to the bleeding of resources from the South in the form of illicit financial flow. And once again, the recommendations are very clear. We do not believe that these reforms can be taken up by the OECD, but they need to be discussed in a universal intergovernmental tax commission under the auspices of the United Nations. There are very many other dimensions to the creating a new fair tax regime, but this is certainly the key governance transition. And lastly, of course, the need to regulate global finance. And the regulation of global finance requires much more than has been done since the past crisis, because since the past crisis, the growth of the asset management industry has been humongous. And therefore, it's very clear that while the main point of entry of regulation has been banks, we need to regulate much more the type of financial activity rather than the type of financial actor. So there is a need to really reclaim the need to somehow bring global finance under democratic control. And there are a number of initial recommendations in the C20 working group outcome that point to that direction. So that's a little bit, I think, the overview. Number one, look at a comprehensive real economy transformation. Number two, look at a set of short-term measures that provide liquidity to countries, primarily centered around debt relief. Number three, structural systemic reform that ultimately are economic governance reform, such as the creation of mechanisms for debt restructuring, for tax normative developments, and for global finance regulation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano, for that very comprehensive take on the financial sector. I think most of the countries right now are struggling with their debt sustainability because of the pandemic that is crossed. And we can attest to this in India also, how private sectors and a lot of middle class segment is stuck with their debts and they are unable to repay it. I think there's a need for a much wider economic transformation that can be only necessitated at the G20 level. Thank you, Stefano, for that, for your response on that. Now we will move to Anselmo, for he will examine the COVID-19 response and the need for coordinated advocacy at the global multilateral level. It can be G20, G7, UN, and all those areas, and how we can respond. Okay, not G7, UN at least.
Topic given to me was an impossible task, you see, civil society organization, multilateral, blah, 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 So I trying to have the tables according to the questions. The first one is, before we discuss CSO strategies, I think we need to be clear about what does mean by COVID-19 pandemic, the so-called scope, these days everybody use the term pandemic, but initially it was an epidemic and now becoming endemic. That means there is no end, So somehow we have to learn how to live with the pandemic. This is a situation now, but nevertheless, still many countries are facing serious challenge as a pandemic. But so when it comes to CSO, very surprisingly, I think compared to previous disasters or crises, I think this was very special in the sense that almost all sectors, almost all countries are affected, And also compared to other previous one, and usually it's a developing country problem, you know, but this time the so-called developed country, Europe, US was the, you know, the hardest hit country. In that sense, we need to have a really new perspective, new approach on this pandemic. So I made a short table to understand, you know, the scope of this pandemic. You know, initially these direct victims, you know, they are those so-called infected with the COVID-19 virus, and then they are not infected, but they are medically affected. You know, there are many, especially the care center and the old people, those who have other disease, they are also heavily affected because many people were killed, of course, mainly by the COVID-19, but not necessarily directly by COVID-19. So that's why we have to see both, you know, COVID-19 itself and also those who are affected. At the same time, because of government policy, lockdown, shutdown, there are a lot of heavy impact on socio-economic impact, which creates, you know, contribute to the another type of human rights violation, you know, especially economic, social, cultural, right? And also because of government control, and also because of, you know, this crisis, there are a lot of the xenophobic discrimination, as we see in the United States here and there, you know, all the problem underlying, they are now also coming up, you know, in the context of COVID-19, you know, and then it becomes the governance crisis locally, nationally, and now the global governance, you know. So question is, I mean, we have a different types of NGO, local, national, regional, global. We are all affected one or another. We are addressing those challenges, but these challenges are all interconnected, you know. So when it comes to international organization, as you see, we have a G20. I don't have to mention because already addressed by other speakers. And then UN also, we have a primarily the WHO, but everybody knows it's not really functioning. It's not performing very well. So the whole health governance. And then when it comes to humanitarian aid, we have WFP. And then UN Secretary General as a general coordination, he produced a lot of report and appeal, policy brief. I don't know whether there's really impact on the ground, you know, because now it is the member states, not the international organization, that play the key role in addressing real problem on the ground. And then we have SDG, HLPF July, but this is a simply talk shop, you know, the forum. It's not really decision-making body. And also we have a human rights. As you know, human rights high commissioner and also many special rapporteurs, they try very hard to bring the issue and monitoring, but they are not also effective enough to solving the real problem on the ground. By the way, there's a Human Rights Council taking place in Geneva now, you know. And then, as Stefano mentioned, we have a financial economic issues, World Bank, IMF, you know. So obviously we have many CSOs working on those international organizations even before pandemic. But because of this pandemic, there is a very interesting phenomenon, you know, because it's a crossover, you know, and there are a lot of exchange between the different groups because they need each other, you know. So as you see, this is a people's health movement, and they have been working on WHO, you know. So their issue was access to vaccine, you know. So now there is a war on vaccine. Who is going to invent the vaccine and how we are going to distribute, how much, whether there is a public access, free access, you know. These are the huge issues. I think one of the top concern for many CSOs. And second one is humanitarian medical aid, you know, the mask, sanitizer, personal protection equipment, and so on and so on. Medicine Sans Frontières, you know, Red Cross, they are also working on those issues. And then you know, many of us also we engage the civic space issues, you know, because of lockdown and shutdown, there are a lot of, you know, our freedom of expression assembly has been limited and then curtailed. So this is also another CSO advocacy issues, and also information right, you know. For instance, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they also issue very strong statements about privacy, surveillance, infodemics, you know, especially the CCTV, and then use of the IC technologies to trace, you know. Of course, that is for the sake of the public's health, but it also can create a lot of the human rights problems, you know, violations. And then the violence also one of the top issues for many CSOs. And because like India, I don't know how many people are really killed by the coronavirus, but a lot of people, so considerable number of people were killed during the lockdown, you know, because of domestic violence, you know, violence against women, violence against children. This is, it's not only India, this is a universal problem, you know, the Europe, Korea, everywhere, there's a violence, but this is invisible, you know. So people are dying not because of the virus, but because of side effect, you know, after effect, like domestic violence. And food crisis, and migrant refugees peace, and economic justice, and so climate justice, because as we know, one of the structural causes of this coronavirus was climate change, deforestation, and then the urbanization, and so on and so on. So I think the human rights, environmental group also come into this, the fight against the coronavirus, which means it's not only the, you know, specialized group or working on medical, you know, and human rights group, humanitarian, economic, social, almost all, you know, cross sector, the civil society now engaging. But as you rightly point out, we don't have very good coordination mechanisms, you know, because governments are divided, and you know, UN also divided, a lot of fragmentation. So this is one of the key challenges. But I don't know, frankly, whether G20 can play their role. You know, we had the virtual summit, but there is no serious follow-up mechanism. So I cannot propose at this stage, you know, in terms of global governance, who and then which can play the leading role. And also, as many CSO criticize, UN Secretary General, I don't know, I mean, his leadership also in question, you know. So now, and also, and we, as we see, we have a China-US hegemonic, you know, confrontation. So many people are saying, you know, instead of G2, G0, you know. So, you know, this is a crisis of global governance, and then we are facing those challenges every day, you know. So, in conclusion, to end with a positive note, my suggestion is, since many of us, in not only the C20 process, but also UN and many others, I think we can kind of lose coordination, because there are so many issues, so many initiatives, we don't know who is doing what, you know. So at least around the C20 group, maybe you can do mapping, and then we can continue this type of dialogue, not ad hoc, but more systematic manner, so that we can understand who is doing what, and where is the area for cooperation and synergy. You know? I hope the meeting, the June meeting, can be the starting of the building the alliance with more information and strategies. Thank you. Let me stop here. Yeah.
Thank you, Anselmo. Thank you for that presentation. It's very important because we need to see how global multilaterals also respond to the pandemic, such as UN, the banks who are working, the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because most of them have also committed a tune of financial assistances. And what are the strategies? How are they helping countries cope with this? So I think Anselmo clearly variegated his presentation and showed us how and what kind of responses and actions and strategies are coming up. So now we open the discussion to our participants. If anyone has any question related to the panel, please kindly unmute yourself and go ahead. So I think it's been an interesting discussion as to the whole process of the G20, and we are looking forward actually when we can have the Indian G20 also. And for this, we have already started, and we are thankful that we have Heinrich Ball-Stiftung, who is participating with us right now, and who's been actively been a companion for our global development projects and all. So for the G20 also, we are trying to see how we can bring out certain issues and how Indian civil society can also prepare to better and have an effective, meaningful dialogue with the government of India. And on similar lines, I think the previous C20s also have been organized on the providing civil society organizations a voice and a platform with respective presidencies and host countries. So any questions related to the process, the C20 process, any observations, any confusions, anyone having?
I have one question.
Yes, sir, please answer.
I think it is to everybody. There are attempts reconfiguration of the G, you know, those, I don't know, it's G, you know, this, the numbers, you know. Traditionally, we have, as Ricardo said, we have G7, become G8, and then now back to G7, and then now we have G20. But you know, the Trump, 2 weeks ago, he tried to create a G11. And then he wants to invite more to G7 meeting, which is postponed to September now, because US is a host, and then next year, and the UK is a host. You know, UK is a host of G7, and so this creates a lot of the controversy. You know, and then those 5 we invited to G7. I mean, the Trump wants to invite was Australia, and South Korea, and then India, and then Russia, right? The South Africa, I don't know, you know. So this was very controversial. And then there was no official response from the CSO because this is a Trump show, you know, as you know, we didn't take it seriously. But nevertheless, that shows very clearly, you know, G7 is not working, G20 is not working, UN is not working. So which means, I mean, we as a CSO, we want to strengthen global governance, you know, so that we can address global problem more effectively. So now, but our targets is now disappearing. Where to target, you know? So these are big questions. So I don't know the Saudi point of view. I mean, Saudi is a host of G20. Next is Italy, because hosting is important. But nevertheless, now question is not simply the one country hosting, you know, whole the systemic problem, you know, global governance, especially the UN, and then G20, and then different types of grouping, you know. So I don't know whether we need to discuss more seriously. It's a meta, you know, it's not single issue, so more long-term and the more fundamental issues. I don't know whether anybody has some reflection on this issue. You know?
No, Anselmo, can I add something?
Oh yes, please.
See, it's a very very important point you have raised, and I also tried to touch it when I was giving initial remarks. You know, in this crisis, which is globally today, and as many of the participants have said, that COVID crisis has also exposed many what you call fault lines in the systems and in the society, and also in the global diplomatic relationships. So in this whole crisis situation, if you see, there are many international institutions which are being questioned, redesigned, and realigned. And as it happens in the lockdown at the domestic level, quite possible at global level also, when these institutions are redesigned, restructured, the space for civil society will be compromised. So I think we have to keep our eyes open. We have to see that how these institutions are getting redefined, and how we can secure the space for civil society in those institutions. We have this example of WHO. Now see, everyone is after WHO. Now WHO, if WHO gets weakened, then you get the largest investor on health, then is your Gates Foundation. You know, then you have to be careful that how we can, you know, in this restructuring of the systems, we keep our space. So your point is very valid, and really we have to keep our eyes open. And secondly, you know, regarding this whole G20 scenario, we had our first meeting with the Indian Sherpa a few months back, I think before lockdown. And the process has started, in which, you know, contacting the groups and engagement groups, and how we are going to move ahead after Italy, how we are going to learn from the process. I think that has also started. But that is also very challenging because we don't know what will be the situation in 2022.
May I respond to Anaro, please?
Yes, please.
Yes, Anaro, the C20 is a very open forum and body of people. So any indigenous person, anyone you see, please direct them to the website where they can register and take part. Their input will be taken into consideration in all the documents that come out. I think we've been very successful, specifically with the Pacific South, with the Pacific Islands and some places in Africa. So please, with members, please send our link to anybody you see will benefit from this. With regards to all the different bodies, I think what we need to do is continue the work that we do at the C20 and take that with us to all the other bodies out there, governing bodies and government, whether it's UN, G, whatever number it is, all these. The policy pack is solid. The policy pack is good. The policy pack can be used, and the recommendations in there are applicable to all these, to lobby for them in all these fora, if you will.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Deirdre from Forus has a question. Yes, please go ahead, Deirdre. Unmute yourself.
Thanks very much, and thanks for organising such an interesting discussion today. I suppose I have a question really directed at Anselmo, because he's just spoken there about advocacy, and he made a couple of points I really agreed with about, you know, the need to strengthen global governance, that G20 isn't working, G7 isn't working, the UN system isn't working. So it's about civil society trying to think outside of the box about some key advocacy calls or proposals that we can make at these, you know, at meetings like the G20 meeting. And it seems that a lot of the talk this morning has been about debt cancellation, debt resolution, but also I think we're all aware that for societies and for economies to recover after the COVID-19 pandemic, it will be necessary to stimulate economies to actually allow them to recover from some of the more negative impacts of the pandemic. So a stimulus of some kind will also be necessary. So is it something that Anselmo believes that civil society could do, is to come together and, rather than having so many competing messages and ideas, to come up with one big overarching advocacy message for example, the G20 meeting that's due to happen very soon, where we call for something that combines both debt resolution with a stimulus package, a global stimulus package. Some have suggested maybe the proper resourcing of SDG implementation globally, and that this could be done in a way by the international community so that, you know, resources would be distributed equitably and fairly between, you know, all of the countries of the world. Is there a reason why civil society can't do that kind of thinking now and come up with a proposal that it would be able to put to the G20 and at least get the leaders, the political leaders, thinking along those lines and thinking out of the box, really, because it's clear that the more conventional macroeconomic responses are not going to help, you know, societies and economies all around the world to recover from this you know, the pandemic and all that has happened, you know, because of it. Thank you.
You know, I've been reflecting on that question for some time, but now question is, you know, there is concern, pros and cons, you know, and politically it's not easy to bring everybody in the one, you know, platform under one slogan, which is impossible. But nevertheless, I think we have to find a way, you know, working our own issues. At the same time, there are common issues, you know, common issues, which we can work together as a one single message, because that's, I believe, is necessary in terms of, you know, communication, the impact, you know, because otherwise, you know, there are so many issues, so many initiative, lobby group, but at the end of the day, government, there is a one government, there is a one UN, that they have to make a choice, you know. In that sense, we need to be more effective in terms of, you know, choosing the message and so on and so on. But question is now the SDG, you know. But my feeling is, big question is now, there is a tendency, you know, when there's one crisis, we run after this one and then another crisis. But very surprisingly, there's no serious effort to address this COVID-19 from SDG point of view, and then trying to address within the framework of SDG. But now, and a little bit better, but in the beginning, you know, so a lot of money going to, in the name of humanitarian assistance, like a disaster, you know, and ad hoc basis, you know, rather than systemic issues. So in that sense, I think we need to, for instance, those are working on WHO, you know, People's Health Movement. I did one day the webinar with them, you know, but they are not so much interested in the HLPF, you know, because they have no resources, not interest, and also their priority is WHO, you know. But those like us, you know, we are also more focused on New York, HLPF, you know. So I think that's why we need to have a more dialogue between the specialized group, advocacy group, and also so-called general, multi-sectoral, multi-issue group, like, Civicus, Action for Sustainable Development, and so on and so forth, and so on, So I wouldn't say now that's not that's impossible, but possible. But we need to make a conscious effort to bring to have a more better dialogue. Otherwise we just one person, one organizer come and then flag and then just follow me and then let's bring all in one. They can be very counterproductive. So this is my comment and partially answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Anselmo. Thank you for that. I see Stefano has raised his hand. Stefano, if you can go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not too sure I go along with some of the things I've heard. So, of course, we can go on with a narrative that, the UN doesn't work and probably doesn't, but that's not the point. The issue is not that the UN doesn't work and therefore we need to look for another place. We need to understand what are the reasons why the UN doesn't work. And the reasons why it doesn't work is because we live in a moment in which we have a significantly polarized political scenario. We have very, very strong divergences between countries, in between the US and everyone else, in between even within the region. If you look region by region, you have significantly different positions on generally any topic, literally. So that's not something that is going to find resolution because we shift from one place to the next. And of course, these polarizing perspectives and very often significant political tensions in economic and socio-economic strategies will simply replicate in any space in which that you would create. So I don't think we need to encourage any more forum shifting that is already happening. We need to recognize that this is a strange moment in history. And the only place in which we at least have some anchoring points in terms of process, in terms of human rights, in terms of social and economic development objectives remains the UN space. The moment we abandon that because we look for another place, being it anything, we of course lose all those anchoring. So I think we need to recognize that this is not a phase in which we can win a lot. It's probably a phase in which we need to hold the ground, try and protect some of the past normative and policy achievements, recognizing that in many ways there is a significant divergence in implementation, in coherence, and all of that. That's just the reality. We just need to create spaces for resistance. I think what most civil society across spaces haven't realized, because a lot of civil society processes don't live in the real world, but they live in some sort of cyberspace, that this is a moment for resistance, it's not a moment for wins. And therefore resistance requires that you choose the space in which you can best resist and try to make sure that that's a place in which you bring your fights. I believe that remains the UN for all its dystopian realities today. And therefore that's where we need to continue organizing. Now, I also kind of disagree with the notion, civil society is very disconnected across so many lines. It's part of its nature, and it's part of the way in which it has evolved. And I think I would be extremely concerned with any homogenizing hegemonic effort to bring it together in one way or the other. Having said that, I think today civil society coordinates much better than it has ever done in many domains. It certainly does in areas related to food justice. It doesn't do very well on health. I agree with Anselmo on that. Although I don't think I would have a PHM-centric view of the health domain. I think there are many organizations that work on health. There's very significant divergences between those that engage in primary service delivery and those that engage in policy. And it's not easy to recompose it. But I would say there's quite a lot of going on in a Geneva-centered and beyond process. I'm talking about global health, of course, and not talking about the national level. There's certainly probably the highest level of coordination ever experienced on economic justice movements across the UN, the international financial institutions, and now even with a much stronger synchrony with the Civil 20 and therefore the G20 process. And I could continue. So my feeling is that I wouldn't be so concerned. The reality is that it's a different way of organizing. It's a much more process based. It requires continuous engagement into collective processes. And some organizations don't have capacity for it, and that's certainly a challenge. And very often, at least in some of the platforms in which I operate, we need to always avoid the risk of being excessively Eurocentric to ensure that there is a strong Southern participation and leadership. And this requires strong ground rules. I think they are not always there, and they need to be strengthened to make sure we all move together at the pace in which we can move together, rather than having always some rushing. But it's also true that some organizations beyond capacity simply don't like it because they're used to have a free ride, and therefore they don't like the idea that they need to negotiate their points into a collective process, particularly the large international NGOs or the most strongly and politically positioned sort of networks. So I guess it's a moment of readjustment, but I wouldn't have the negative assessment that sometimes is portrayed with all these dystopian and dysfunctionalities. I think we're actually doing quite a good job despite all our circumstances. And there's, of course, much more that has to be done, but I wouldn't have such a negative assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Are there any more observations or comments that need to be put out? Because we are running out of time. Actually, we're just nearing out the time. So if anyone has any short comments or any observations, please go ahead. Ricardo?
Yeah, maybe that, I'm quite in line with Stefano, saying that there are many options we are using that are useful also to help in feeding this relationship. There are networks and Stefano already said, but also opportunity like, I'm referring to Anselmo, the invitation Anselmo repeated twice last year and this year for the PPF, or meeting like that online that we are doing now. Other initiative, I did introduce myself when I spoke before. I am not only a member of GCAP Italy and of the Italian delegation in the Civil 20 process, but also one of the 3 global co-chair of GCAP. As GCAP, we organized the People Assembly in September, parallel to the UNGA, inviting a lot of people and providing just the organization service. And there were a lot of organization and networks from all over the world, indigenous people networks and whatever. And I think that these opportunities are useful also to feed a culture and relation among us. And another point that I wanted to add on the issue of global governance, I think that a strategic, not the only one, of course, but the strategic dimension is the regional one. And I think that even as civil society, we have to see how we can talk with the regional institution and even strengthen regional institution. Regional institution sometimes start with a very contradictory process. If we look, so we don't make example related to Europe, where I come from, or Asia, where the majority of the people attending the meeting are coming from. But if we look at the history of African Union was born in a very strange way, if we want to, but is playing an interesting role today. For instance, when you have coup d'etat or a suspension of democracy, I mean, regional institution can be an opportunity to simplify and to strengthen global governance. And we could even think about that, speaking about civil society role and feeding better, strengthening the relation we had when we are doing that work. I mean, we are doing a good work at the regional level, but sometimes regional levels don't speak together. And anyway, another point, and I conclude there, and I end there. Stefano was referring to resistance. Yeah, I think that COVID is a very deep crisis, but it is a crisis happening in a world that was facing a very strong crisis in terms also of political culture. If UN is weak, is also because we are facing all this process of violence, of increasing of populism, of nationalism. There are weakening international institutions. So I think that it's important also to understand how we address not only technical messages, as some economic message can be understood and they are not, but to develop, to keep aloud a strong a voice against violence and in favor to peace. The number of people suffering for injustice coming from this kind of political season, political division, political tension and competition, like the number of undernourished people, and we have a lot of other cases before the COVID crisis, are increasing. And I think that we have, even when we are making, are doing, are active in a very technical advocacy, it's important to always raise that wider political dimension that is looking at the quality of life of human beings. And yes, we are in the middle of a very difficult time, and I think we have to balance global messages with diverse attitude and process and actions, and being also conscious that sometimes there is a competition between and among civil society, and sometimes we are creating problems among ourselves with these very old human habits that are absolutely present in civil society. Let me conclude thanking Saudi friends and KKF, the Saudi Secretariat and chair of the C20 process, because they are doing a very interesting job. I think that even having in Saudi Arabia, the Secretary this year probably helped in creating rooms, as with Harsh we said during the handover meeting of the C20 in Japan last November. The presence of C20 opened probably some rooms for civil space, for civil society space within the country. And this is happening every time in the country. It happens in Russia and can be an opportunity that we have to take, and hopefully it will be for us, for India and all the other next G20 hosting countries, to have, to strengthen the voice and the possibility to meet, even when freedom are not so protected, not so guaranteed during the time of the chairing and during the following. So from our side, for instance, for sure, we will continue working with the South of France, trying to share an opportunity to develop the voice of civil society in our countries.
Thank you, Ricardo. Okay, so I think we can formally close this session if there are no more questions. There has been a suggestion by Osama that we have a group photo. If we can all switch on our cameras. But Osama, how do we have that? I think we'll have to take a screenshot or something.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me take one photo.
Yes, Selma will do it. Sure.
This is surveillance. This is, do you know these are surveillance? You know, all the universities, they impose this one, you know, the registration. Otherwise, you don't. Oh, Aoi, hello.
Thank you everyone for joining for this conversation, and it was lovely having you all over here. Thank you so much. I firmly believe that we can take this conversation ahead, more forward in the coming days, and let's hope we make a strong and effective and meaningful G20 in the coming days. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Hello, Deidra.
Bye, ciao.